In this video, I will introduce you to a thriving field of study known as Computational Literary Studies, or CLS for short. The intellectual genealogy of CLS can be traced in several ways. CLS may be regarded as a subfield of the digital humanities, though some outsiders or critics erroneously use the terms CLS and DH interchangeably, including the academic who coined the term CLS herself. Another way to look at CLS is as an extension of Moretti's distant reading. This is evident in Ted Underwood's tweet, who prefers the term distant reading to CLS, for reasons that I will explain later. Or, CLS can be understood as large-scale explorations of textual corpora in the tradition of the sociology of literature, which predates both DH as well as Moretti's distant reading. CLS is a contentious term because it was coined by one of the most outspoken critics of its purported practitioners. In 2019, Nanda, an English professor at the University of Notre Dame, published a scathing review essay titled "The Computational Case Against Computational Literary Studies" in the journal Critical Inquiry. The targets of Da's criticism had no idea they were part of a group called CLS until they were labeled as such. There are numerous historical precedents for this. Individuals who did not previously associate with each other formed strong bonds when they were labeled as political or religious heretics, for example. Since 2019, some outsiders have used CLS loosely to refer to literary scholars who advocate for data-rich, data-based, data-driven, data-assisted, computational, or statistical methods. Please keep in mind that all these terms have different connotations and should be used with caution and precision. In Europe, there is a CLS infra network supported by European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. In my digital humanities curriculum, I like to start by showing students how Franco Moretti approaches distant reading, and then differentiate that early experiment from the efflorescence of the so-called CLS scholarship that takes place after 2015. Before we begin, I should state that I am not an expert in CLS. I am a digital historian who specializes in the use of network analysis and graph database technology in medieval East Asian sources. I am primarily interested in preparing the historical profession for the disruptions brought about by society's ongoing digital transformation. The shift from primarily print-based to primarily digital media-based scholarship is central to my research agenda. But as you will see today, the preoccupation with digital technologies is not something that is necessarily shared by CLS. To get the most out of this video, please read Ted Underwood's articles. First, Distant Reading and Recent Intellectual History, which is Chapter 44 of Debates in the Digital Humanities 2016. Second, A Genealogy of Distant Reading, published in the journal Digital Humanities Quarterly in 2017, as well as his book, Distant Horizons. I also strongly recommend reading Catherine Bode's book, A World of Fiction, which is accessible at the University of Michigan Press website on open access. And finally, Hoyt Long's monograph, The Values in Numbers, particularly the introduction and chapters 1 and 2. Follow the links in the video description for more details. In this video, I will make frequent references to these publications. Let's begin with Ted Underwood, who provides a succinct and incisive definition of distant reading that has a different tone than Moretti's. In the opening paragraphs of Distant Reading and Recent Intellectual History, he says this: I love the phrase distant reading. It is vivid, it doesn't overemphasize technology, and it candidly admits that new methods are mainly useful at larger scales of analysis, is how I describe what I do. Many academics enjoy coining new terms and phrases, and so I admire Underwood for avoiding this practice when a useful term or phrase already exists. When an academic invents a buzzword, the assumption is often that they're starting something for which there is no precedence. In Underwood's case, he is interested in in literary scholarship conducted in much larger scales than what is done typically. And distant reading, to him, captures this intention rather intuitively. Of course, those of you who watched my distant reading video would recognize that large-scale analysis is only one aspect of Moretti's distant reading as outlined in Conjectures on World Literature. As you will see shortly, Underwood is a careful reader and writer, so you should not think of this as a misreading of Moretti. In addition, notice Underwood's reservations about the overemphasis on technology. This is also evident throughout his book, Distant Horizons. Keep this in mind as we continue reading and consider why this is the case. So, back to Underwood. But the phrase, and by the phrase here he means distant reading, does have two disadvantages. First, since distant reading was coined by Franco Moretti on or around the year 2000, the phrase may seem to name a completely new project. In fact, as Catherine Bode has noted, the questions posed by distant readers are often continuous with older traditions of book history. And as Jim English has noted, they are continuous with the sociology of literature. The second disadvantage of the phrase distant reading is more serious. By defining a new mode of reading, the phrase suggests to some that this project is still contained in literary studies, just another stage of our debate about the right way to interpret literature. That assumption has made conversation on the topic needlessly parochial, and polemical. We have spent too much time on inward-looking debates that pit distant against close reading, and not enough time understanding connections to other disciplines. According to Underwood, what Moretti calls distant reading is not a radical departure, but rather something that builds on long traditions that investigate the emergence and circulation of canonical works in broader contexts. He is opposed to rebranding efforts, especially the tendency among many humanities scholars to frame their research in terms of dialectics and conflicts, as if their contribution is only meaningful when the previous paradigm is overturned and a new label is applied. And here, as an aside, let me share something. The term overturning is one of the most frequently asked questions DH scholars receive from the audience. Not that you examined 20,000 data points or 2 million or whatever instead of 20. Did you overturn the previous paradigm, people ask. But you see, the goal of digital or computational humanities is to introduce corrections, revisions, and alternative perspectives, just like any kind of good scholarship, and not to overthrow the previous paradigm. If one data model manages to topple your entire field, it is likely that your field was built on a shaky and deeply flawed foundation. Fortunately, the majority of humanities researchers have been trained to produce meticulous scholarship, so this is not usually the case. So if distant reading is nothing new, and not something that should be regarded as the antithesis of close reading, what does Underwood hope to achieve? The answer is found in the next paragraph. Distant reading is better understood as part of a broad intellectual shift that has also been transforming the social sciences. The best publicized part of this shared story is an increase in the sheer availability of data mediated by the internet and digital libraries. Because changes of scale are easy to describe, journalists often stop here, reducing recent intellectual history to the buzzword big data. While Underwood does not coin a new term, he redefines Moretti's distant reading from abstract to statistical modeling. The subtitle of Moretti's book, Graphs, Maps, Trees, is literally Abstract Models for Literary History. Many visuals and diagrams in graphs, maps, trees are not products of statistical analysis, nor Moretti's own creations, but rather reproductions from studies by other literary scholars, suggesting, again, that distant reading is not a new paradigm, but rather a continuation or reworking of a longer tradition. Instead, Underwood advocates for something else. Underwood is invested in DH to the extent that the rise of the internet and projects like Google Books have inspired the creation of massive digital libraries and collections. However, his focus is not on digital technologies or digital media. From Underwood's perspective, the availability and accessibility of massive amounts of data signal the need for the humanities to adopt and train in quantitative methods, as the social science disciplines have done for many years. In Distant Horizons, Underwood positions himself as somebody who aims to make discoveries in literary studies and literary history, as opposed to implicitly Moretti's abstract modeling. He is interested in testing, using concrete terms and large amounts of data, what literary historians have postulated about genre, audience, character, gender, and various other features and trends. This anti-foundational approach builds, say, a statistical model of 10,000 literary works and tries to reveal the Victorian era or the emergence of science fiction without presupposing the existence of such entities in the great unread, or you might call the great understudied. Catherine Bode presents a different take on distant reading, highlighting the shifting definitions and the gap between Moretti's goals and his computational practice. Bode's observation is similar to how I presented Moretti in my distant reading video. Let us start with Bode's critique of Moretti and another important book, Macroanalysis, written by Moretti's former Stanford research associate Matthew Jockers. Underappreciated in commentary on distant reading and macroanalysis is the shifting meanings of both terms. When Moretti originally proposed distant reading in Conjectures on World Literature in 2000, it was a new critical method for world literary studies, not for literary history. Distant reading aims to overcome the focus on national canons by collating the work of multiple scholars to identify and explore, quote, units that are much smaller or much larger than the text, devices, themes, tropes, or genres and systems. This quote sounds familiar because I introduced the same quote in my distant reading video previously. Keep in mind Bode's distinction between literary studies and literary history. While there is some overlap between the two modes of scholarship, they're not the same. And let's continue. With this 2005 book, Graphs, Maps, Trees, Abstract Models for Literary History, the framework of world literary studies was superseded by literary history. Indeed, a national formation of that endeavor focused on 18th and 19th century British literature. While units smaller or larger than the text were theoretical notions in his Conjectures essay, in this book they are translated into data points. So, as we've discussed on this channel too, it is important to take note of how Moretti's distant reading originates from a concern with literary studies and fair representation of canonical works to being primarily interested in computational methods, as Bode points out here. Let's continue. Computational methods and digital resources were in turn central to Moretti's 2013 book, Distant Reading, but there, literary history was sitting ground to the theory of literature as the focus in the encounter of computation and criticism. Interesting. Although literary data remains central, the primary object of distant reading is now less often literary systems, designated social, material, and political contexts for literary development and change, than the concepts of literary studies. And while Moretti previously identified the importance of literary systems in their inclusion of the Great Unread, these concepts of literary study, including characterization, plot, and dramatic form, are approached predominantly through formal and computational analysis of canonical literary works. Isn't that interesting? Between 2000 and 2013, Moretti's research shifts dramatically, and I believe both makes compelling observations here. In 2010, a few friends and I had the opportunity to meet Moretti at a digital humanities workshop. Naturally, we inquired about the datasets and computational methods he used to write graphs, maps, trees. And I still recall how surprised we all were to learn that Moretti's research only made limited uses of digital technologies and computing. At around the time, in 2010, Moretti, along with Matthew Jockers, founded the Stanford Literary Lab to pursue what he referred to as computational criticism. However, as Bode points out, one has to wonder what Moretti planned to do with his distant reading vision. What happened to the desire to challenge the status quo and reshape the world literary canon? What became of the power disparities between the core, semi-peripheral, and peripheral countries? Why does he turn to abstract modeling and literary history in 2005, and then to computational criticism of, ironically, canonical literary works in 2013? Some of these inconsistencies may not surprise careful readers of the Conjectures essay, and as DH experts, you should be aware of this lack of coherence and understand the differences between Moretti in 2000, Moretti in 2005, and Moretti in 2013. Interestingly, Bode finds a similar pattern in Jockers as well. Jockers' focus has remained more consistent over time, but his recent work demonstrates the same shift from literary history, his explicit concern in his 2013 book Macroanalysis, Digital Methods, and Literary History, to categories of literary analysis. In his case, plot and characterization. Yet even as Moretti and Jockers have moved from a historical to a conceptual emphasis in their own work, distant reading and macroanalysis dominate and also limit public and much academic perception of what data-rich literary history entails. And Bode attributes the reason for his fame to the term being publicized in major media outlets, including the Financial Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Paris Review, etc., etc. But more important than our criticisms of Moretti and Jockers are Bode's contributions to DH and their unique perspective on English literature as a scholar of Australia. Bode exhibits self-awareness that is sometimes lacking in the work of some of our American counterparts. The title of our book already clearly defines the scope of our research as one that focuses on fiction rather than world literature in its entirety. A world of fiction also has a much stronger digital component than Moretti, Jockers, and Underwood. Her research relies on Trove, a newspaper database created by the National Library of Australia. In 19th century Australia, newspaper serialization was the primary means of publishing and reading fiction. So to investigate this phenomenon, Bode created her own digital scholarly edition that contains over 16,500 works of fiction extracted from Trove. As a literary historian who created her own digital archive, Bode goes into great detail about a topic that Moretti, Jockers, and Underwood only mention in passing: source criticism and sampling. What aspects of a literary culture are represented by the textual sample? The computational work of Moretti, Jockers, and Underwood rely on something called the HathiTrust Digital Library, a large digital collection maintained by a collaborative network of academic and research libraries in the United States that provide reading access to over 17 million digitized items. Jockers published macro-analysis during the height of big data fetishization that claimed that sampling is obsolete, which is a highly problematic assumption as apparent in this section of Jockers' macro-analysis. Today, however, the ubiquity of data, so-called big data, is changing the sampling game. Indeed, big data are fundamentally altering the way that much science and social science get done. The existence of huge data sets means that many areas of research are no longer dependent upon controlled artificial experiments or upon observations derived from data sampling. Instead of conducting controlled experiments or samples and then extrapolating from the specific to the general or from the close to the distant, these massive data sets are allowing for investigations at a scale that reaches or approaches a point of being comprehensive. The once inaccessible population has become accessible and is fast replacing the random and representative sample. In another part of his book, he also makes this claim. These ideas about the inevitability of literary change and about the inevitability of the form and shape of creativity are still ideas. Ideas supported by 3,346 observations and 2,032,248 of data points, but ideas nevertheless. We will return to the fetishization of big data as an objective window into reality in a future video that discusses Lev Manovich and cultural analytics. Underwood's motivation is not omniscience. Rather, his push for statistical modeling, random sampling, and large-scale quantitative explorations is to mitigate his discomfort with how literary history has been written. There's simply a lot we don't know about literary history above the scale of, say, 100 volumes. We've become so used to ignorance at this scale and so good at bluffing our way around it that we tend to overestimate our actual knowledge. A good example of this is Moretti's distant reading of detective fiction and the quantitative study of romance by another literary scholar, Janice Radway. Both studies are summarized in Underwood's A Genealogy of Distant Reading, are based on samples of about 20. So how do we know Moretti and Radway are correct? While Underwood does not explicitly state this, the answer is prestige and stature. And also, the issue is not unique to English literature either. I am aware of at least one instance in East Asian literature where a junior scholar prepared an abstract modeling similar to what Moretti and Radway did with over 100 vernacular stories. But this person's work was rejected during peer review, and the scholar was even chastised for daring to challenge the authority of a well-known senior academic. As such, authority structure is another dimension to consider when combining literature and computational methods, which brings us to Hoyt Long's The Values in Numbers. Long's book begins with an intriguing debate on the role of statistics in medicine that took place in Paris in 1837. Is medicine more of a science or an art? When a doctor sees a patient, does he, and most doctors were male in 19th century France, treat each patient as a unique individual or attempt to place the patient within a range of normal distribution and variation? Long sees an interesting parallel between this story and the current debates about the role of numerical approaches in the study of literature and literary history. As a specialist of Japanese literature, Long points out that numbers were already a part of literary studies when the discipline was formally established in the late 19th century. What exactly is Japanese literature? What should or should not be included? What are some representative examples of Japanese literature? Who decides this? And how does such a sample come about? Long gives the example of 10 prominent figures who were commissioned in 1980 to choose 100 representative works from a total of 1,506, which initially required probabilistic sampling. On the computational side, Long's study makes use of the Aozora Bunko digital collection, which contains approximately 14,300 works of modern Japanese literature, broadly defined. About 40% of the collection is fiction, 1/4 is essays and criticism, 10% is poetry, and the rest is theater, drama, and social science material. The Aozora digital collection was founded in the late 1990s with the goal of creating a virtual library accessible to all, much like the Blue Sky or Aozora, hence the name. So what does Long discover by analyzing Aozora Bunko? I invite you to read his book to find out. This brings us back to the question of what computational literary studies is and how seriously we should take Nanda's critique. My main objection to Da's essay is her emphasis on statistics and her failure to address the significant discursive as well as methodological differences among the literary scholars under review. These are not naive academics who were given a $4 million grant to play with datasets in Python and or R. Da's intervention was useful, though, in highlighting the distinction between exploratory data analysis and hypothesis testing, as well as in attempting to replicate the analysis of data-driven literary studies. On the other hand, I am not convinced by her suggestion that a team of 1,000 people reading one novel per month will result in 15,000 novels being read at the scale. And not to mention, I believe the answer should be 12,000 novels, but maybe I'm missing something here. Perhaps because of my background in intellectual history, which requires lengthy and complicated debates about schools of thought and the relationships among major thinkers and writers, I see CLS as a flawed but somewhat of a useful heuristic for DH newcomers. While CLS is a part of my DH course syllabi, I strongly advise against approaching Ted Underwood, Catherine Bode, or Hoyt Long and referring to them as CLS scholars. Just don't do that. CLS is best used as a temporary category to introduce you to the diversity of discourses and approaches, and then discard it altogether once you understand the distinct characteristics of each major scholar associated with the label CLS. And now that you are more familiar with CLS, why not read Catherine Bode's book and examine how she incorporates insights from book history, as well as compare her data-rich literary history to Ted Underwood or Hoyt Long? Or follow Ted Underwood's arguments in Distant Horizons and see if you agree with this proposal that humanities students spend a semester receiving formal statistics training to become better scholars. That's all for today. Until next time.